Welcome, and it's great to have this somewhat international audience. It's really a pleasure to welcome Carolyn Cartier to Rutgers. It's the kind of thing that probably wouldn't happen if we didn't have Zoom, because Australia is awfully far away. But Carolyn is not only an old friend, but now a professor of human geography and China studies and chair of the Global Studies undergraduate degree at the University of Technology, Sydney. Before that, she also taught at Vassar, University of Oregon, and University of Southern California. All her degrees are from Berkeley, actually, where I also have my PhD. She has spent extensive time living and researching in Greater China, especially Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Xiamen. And she's a founding fellow of the Center for China in the World at the Australian National University and a past Fulbright scholar in Hong Kong. Her work on cities in China draws from spatial thought to examine state territorial practices in the urban process. And she has two major research projects going right now: the geography of power in China, urban expansion and administrative empire, collaborative with East China Normal University faculty, and culture and the city in China, which is out of the ANU Center on China and the World. And each project is producing two monographs. So these are major projects. Her earliest book was Globalizing South China, and she has another monograph in preparation, as well as three co-edited volumes on topics of tourism, macro regions in China, and diaspora, many other different topics as well, especially if you start looking into her published articles. But her work really stands out, not only for its incisive analysis of concepts that might otherwise be taken for granted, but also for its sort of bridgy regional quality spanning the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong, and the Chinese diaspora. And we'll get a little taste of that today. Consequently, she's published in a wide range of journals, including Journal of Asian Studies, Urban Geography, China Information, China Review, as well as Eurasian Geography and Economics, which she also co-edits. So if you're looking for an interesting place to publish, here she is, the editor. Her most recent writing on Hong Kong, quote, among greater issues of the day, Hong Kong and China 2003 to 13, appears in Critical Inquiry. So a very wide range of journals too. And she will speak to us today on the Beijing Palace Museum comes to Hong Kong, aestheticizing the future of the nation. And she told me before you guys came in from the waiting room that she's very interested in feedback. This is a work in progress. So feel free to collect your questions. And shall we do chat? Carolyn, do you like to have a
Certainly.
chat?
But I might ask you to note it. I might not catch it fast enough.
Right, but we can save it so you would have a record of what people are wondering about. Okay, so chat will be on. Please feel free, and then you can raise your hand and restate your question once we get into Q&A. So take it away, Carolyn.
Thank you so much, Louisa. And thank you, Tao, and thank you to the center for inviting me. It's delightful to be here. The best part of the pandemic is global conversation through talks that were otherwise once inaccessible. So let's go. I have a PowerPoint and full of text and image. I'd like to suggest first that there's a narrative organization of the talk. And I'd like you to think with me in the way that if we could shift from the sense of a linear narrative to a dialectical one, because we have to pivot around several positions, a couple of different worldviews in order to bring this story into a rich dialogue that it represents over the past 20 years. The first position here is the idea of the gift, and because the Hong Kong Palace Museum has been portrayed as a gift by Hong Kong's ranking leadership. And it was also presented as a surprise gift. And you can see it here as if a Christmas present. indeed delivered on the Friday before the holiday season, the low news cycle, when it might pass unnoticed in the press. One of the Legislative Council members at the time, when called by Radio and Television Hong Kong to ask whether she knew about the project, simply replied in surprise, which one? So in a China specialist audience, we hardly need to recount what is the Palace Museum. Indeed, the story of the Palace Museum, a saga in itself, an extraordinary story, is one of the greatest of a cultural material collection and of the Chinese Civil War, an extraordinary historical geography, really, of transporting the material culture of the nation around the country to conserve it, to preserve it, to move it. And so in the process, we have, of course, two palace museums. The National Palace Museum, with that formal name, of course, is in Taiwan. And so this is part of the contending history at stake. And so the Hong Kong Palace Museum, of course, is drawing on the collection from Beijing, from the Forbidden City, with its loan to Hong Kong of 800 grade 1 cultural relics. Now, the surprise of the gift, interestingly enough, the gift discourse doesn't appear much in the Chinese, say it again, in the English language media. It appears in the Chinese language media. So if you go to the Hong Kong government website, you'll find the English language coverage and the Chinese coverage of the same article under the same headline differs. And so the Chinese version is about the gift. It's the gift, the greatest gift to celebrate Hong Kong's 20th anniversary, this Palace Museum project. And this gift narrative, Nailing Sum analyzes it very nicely as a neo-Foucauldian discourse of technology for cross-border integration. But I think if we look at that in comparison to this museum project, what Nailing is talking about are those policy measures, those economic policy measures like the economic partnership agreement, various banking measures. And here we have a project. It's really a shift. The discourse continues, but this is really about material construction, requiring Hong Kong land financing, requiring a lot of commitment from Hong Kong. And here from the Facebook page, the landing page changed recently. And thank you for your very kind, lovely page on your center site announcing the talk using part of this image. What we know from the advanced programming has already started for the Hong Kong Palace Museum. And there are programs which emphasize classical culture, material culture, very early material culture, and indeed the ding, the object that represents the very earliest history, going back to the Zhou kings, the symbol of power. It's a symbol of power, a symbol of who has authority and control over land, over empire. And the design architect of the building, Roko Yim, has explained that he's drawn on the imagery of the ding. So the scaffolding just came off 2 days ago. And so this is the media opening where the building is, exterior at least, is now well on view. And the design architect has a track record of landmark prize-winning public architecture in the region. And this is where Hong Kong in the region comes into play for thinking about the significance of the building, its design, the architect, and the relationship to government and government decisions about who designs public architecture. And so the interesting twist then comes in is that the Roko Yim firm was awarded the contract for the building as part of the secret gift. The Guangdong Provincial Museum will come back into the story a little bit later on. And so, national gift or secret plan? by the time the Hong Kong Legislative Council came back into chambers after the holiday season, after the project was announced, the Legislative Council members began their critique. People wanted to know why they found out about it only on WeChat. People wanted to know more about what kind of commitment Hong Kong government had agreed to with the central government. Because, of course, the Beijing Palace Museum is one of the three main cultural institutions directly under the Ministry of Culture. So perhaps the shift then can be to try to position the two governments, their interests, their strategic rationale, perhaps in relation to statecraft, the contentions and statecraft. The context in Hong Kong, and this will have a subsidiary unfolding history, is the role of the West Kowloon Cultural District Authority, because this has an ordinance, statutory relationship in Hong Kong. It has a legal context. So the Legislative Council calls for all the materials and all of the documentary record for the project, and finds that although they're submitted, they're largely redacted. And so the tension and the absence of dialogue takes place. Meanwhile, there's protests. There's significant protests to the project beginning in January 1917. And this is one of the more visible and widely documented among the protests and the way it kind of recalls 1989. And this background, of course, was a poster, large poster facade affixed to the wall in the Hong Kong station, Hong Kong MTR station. Meyer has recently proposed this idea of China's historical statecraft for contemporary China. And yes, it's about representations of the past and how they're deployed by the central government, but it's also about, he's saying, well, they're responding to internationalizing discourses, because they are now trying to kind of position China's global identity in relation to a long established set of discourses about the West, about globalization, about how those are defined, and to kind of resituate a China-based global history through China's kind of refracted dynastic history. So a historical statecraft. If we look to some of the contemporary coverage, very contemporary coverage led by the really the Hong Kong Palace Museum director, we can see some of this starting to come into play between the dialogue going on between central government, between perspectives in Hong Kong allied with government, and this idea of an international public sphere defined by a Chinese history, a Chinese historical statecraft. And so, of course, the China Daily, right, positioned as a media outlet that converses with the international sphere in English, for English language audiences. And so now saying here quite recently, yes, isn't it a symbol of national integration? Which of course was not part of the dialogue in 2017, excuse me. So yes, it's for local education, because we need to respond to the disruptions in society, to the social movement. We need to actually address what is in Hong Kong, the liberal education curriculum. So this has now become explicit, although this is now presenting back in time toward what we know has taken place in 2017, 2018, 2019. But let's look at the site and situation, because the tensions over the project, over the Palace Museum project, are substantially about the larger West Kowloon cultural district, because it occupied the imagination of the transformation of the city in really the first 2 decades of the century, the first 2 decades after the handover, and very much seeing how this site has sort of languished under construction, not quite in development, because the major private property development associated with the site was constructed very quickly. So first conceived really at the handover as a destination arts and culture district that would really outrival any existing in Asia and be on par with, you know, all the world-class discourse, right? The world-class city, the world-class arts and culture precinct now for Hong Kong, overcoming a long-standing kind of popular discourse of the so-called cultural desert. And this had really continued well through the first decade of the handover period. But under development for quite a long time. The first phase of planning was one that played out in the first half of the 2000s. And Foster's firm, which designed the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, the extraordinary landmark bank in Hong Kong, which designed the Hong Kong International Airport, won the design competition. But it's an unusual design, and there's a structural component of the design that was quite seriously problematic, because in that overdetermined property environment that is Hong Kong, the property firms were not only allowed to develop the site, but operate its multiple planned museums without having any remit for the collections. The project was canceled and retabled for reevaluation, but let's look at this. This is the best of the imagery for the canopy design that Foster's proposed. There were a number of public consultations, and the property development firms in Hong Kong put forward their interpretations of the designs. And I can never forget this moment when I took this photograph at one of these public consultations, because people really did look utterly downcast about this project. There was no redeeming it. And so artists in Hong Kong represented this issue in the city, like we have the expression of, well, it's more of a historic expression, maybe a 20th century expression, mid 20th century, a car built on a Friday, maybe you've got a lemon. And there is in Cantonese an expression about, a similar expression having to do with lemons. So the lemon of the canopy that really couldn't be realized. So at the time though, it's not just, I hope you can't hear the local leaf blower in the background, I can. At the same time, there's the social movement that's moving through Hong Kong at the same time now is mounting a citizens-based activist position in response to redefining West Kowloon, the People's Project to redefine West Kowloon. And this goes on through the public consultation process and goes on for several years. And I think it's fair to say completely redefine the West Kowloon Cultural District as the right of the public to be engaged in defining the uses of public space. So this very much lines up with the international scholarship on right to the city, the Lefebvrean ideas about public space, contentions over it, which comes into the West Kowloon Cultural District. So as the property development, the adjacent property development projects go up, West Kowloon languishes. They have hardly more than a sign. The sign is what's prominent. And so the whole land reclamation, the 40 hectares, this comes up as part of the airport core program. The airport core program that built 2 airport stations, 2 new MTR lines, and the Kowloon station, on top of which this entire development sits on the podium. Meanwhile, it becomes curious that West Kowloon Cultural District is languishing in the city that built the airport in record time under budget. This represents paradoxically the opposite. But the site starts to become used in some interesting ways. So the temporary contemporary by the Shigeru Band firm that became a site for debates over culture in the city. And even here as the representatives, indeed, there's Rokoyam, there's Rem Koolhaas, your Office of Metropolitan Architecture. They're the representatives of the Foster firm. And so this was part of the Hong Kong Shenzhen Bi-City Biennale, which has taken place every few years. But the site started to enter the public imagination as really a place of culture in the city, despite the lack of construction. And so a new brief goes out. Let's try again. Let's try again to decide on the site plan design. The Foster firm wins again a decade after they won the first design competition. And now it will feature a large public park. But just at the time that the design brief is released for the second phase, Hong Kong government announces something entirely new that takes everyone by surprise. And this is the also replanned destination terminus of the Guangzhou-Shenzhen Hong Kong Railway, so the so-called express rail, that it would come into West Kowloon rather than terminate further out in the new territories. And this generated then a round of public reaction. This is the winning design for phase 2 of West Kowloon. And the Palace Museum project the site is here. And it replaced what was the large exhibition center, cultural entertainment venue center that was planned on the site. The Palace Museum project has effectively replaced this. So in response to the second phase of planning West Kowloon takes place side by side with debate over the rail line coming in now to the cultural district, which will extend the new central line coming in from Beijing straight to Hong Kong. And so you start to see then reasonably well-known performance artists of various kinds are participating in the dialogue and the conversation of what is going on about culture in the city. And this is in the July 1st, 2009 march, the public march. And so the private property development side of West Kowloon is finished. And so many people have weighed in on the city space of Hong Kong through a variety of kind of conceptual perspectives. and local arts have taken it on as well. And so it starts to become a discussion about culture in the city, about socioeconomic inequality, and the most intensive kind of public discussion on city space that Hong Kong has seen. Exhibits one after another in alternative art spaces, and this kind of aesthetics of politics, the bringing kind of public art to these questions over politics in the city, the politics of public space. So another round of activity takes place, but here what we have is actually a set on the governing side where the leadership of the West Kowloon Cultural Development Authority starts to resign, sort of one person after another. And this is sort of the highlight, where Lars Nitby, especially, who was the executive director of Amidst, who always said he would see through the M+ Contemporary Arts Museum that won the design competition for that very important contribution to the district, quit. And so this idea of the state presence absence problematic, I suppose this is the, to me, the challenge of the analysis and the kind of interesting representation of the politics from at least two worldviews, multiple perspectives, the tremendous political pressure, yet which is absent in terms of an explicit discourse. The delay in the project starts to become at least an explicit topic. Why has it been delayed for so long? I think the express rail, I include it because I really think it's a diagnostic. From Jutao from the University of Hong Kong Architecture Department. This idea of the reality, the material reality of bringing in the extraordinary express rail, which is the southernmost extension of the national high-speed rail system into central Hong Kong, right into the cultural district. A kind of commitment to the built environment that is associated with infrastructure development in China. And there is, I think, in a Rancierian, through a Rancierian lens, right? Jacques Rancière was writing on the sayable, the unsayable. What is unsayable? There's a certain amount of the unsayable that has taken place in the Legislative Council, asking about why is this a secret? Why do we not have the information? And so my interpretation is that a certain amount of the extraordinary public representation through kind of symbolic arts and culture is responding to the unsayable, is interpreting it. We can come at this in a few ways, I suppose, materializing the nation through cultural infrastructure. There are existing approaches, Lefebvre's work, Tony Bennett's work on the exhibitionary complex, the idea of techno-cities, and certainly infrastructure is quite a hot topic. But I'd like to take a different turn on this. And I'd like to take the turn toward China's own concept of cultural infrastructure facilities. And the reality that all this extraordinary international architecture that's been built from Beijing to Guangzhou, all of the bold contemporary architecture, I think we've forgotten that these iconic edifices are cultural infrastructure facilities whose planning has never ended from the 1950s to the present, and the enduring rationale of socialist urbanism. So to kind of triangulate this in the social sciences way, to pin it down, I think we can look at the larger Hong Kong region because in fieldwork, going back over a decade, been able to obtain actually the cultural infrastructure facilities plans for Guangzhou and really very detailed plans of which buildings have to be built, what is the responsible governing organization, and what is the source of funding. And in its internationalizing mode, Guangzhou held design competitions and awarded these contracts to prominent international firms. The Guangzhou Provincial Museum, here's where that treasure box designed by Roko Yim, which won a number of prizes, comes back into view. It's the most prominent of Guangzhou's new city center cultural infrastructure projects. And it occupies this prime site on the Zhejiang axis and the Tianhe district of Guangzhou. A lot of very good work has been written about this district. And here, but But we tend not to look at the cultural facilities that anchor this district. There's been planning work, city planning work, the contentions over the pre-existing land use here. But here is the prominent Guangzhou Provincial Museum, whose design architect is awarded the Hong Kong Palace Museum contract as part of the surprise gift. It's not just Guangzhou. Foshan, Dongguan, Shunde, the smaller cities of the Delta were all engaged in the construction of cultural infrastructure during the mid-2010s and hired prominent firms, won prizes. And so even Shenzhen, which we never think about in the 1980s as being committed to the notion of cultural infrastructure, no one imagined that in the outpouring of scholarship on Shenzhen, that it too was compelled by central government to construct cultural infrastructure. So I think this is a socialist spatial imperative. Socialist is so freighted with pre-existing meaning, yet this is socialist cultural infrastructure. This is part of the general urban planning, not the very specific kind of Soviet model town notion, but the very general urban planning of socialist urbanism that transferred from Soviet advising first into Beijing in the early 1950s, and then became modeled for cities around the country through the period of the planned economy. See, it continued. And it's not so much, I've come around to thinking, it's not so much that we might continue to say, what is post-socialist about China? But in this urban inquiry, what of socialism continued? Placing in Hong Kong a cultural facility to house an outpost of the nation's ranking material culture collection. It's really this optimism, the forward-looking, the future of the socialist general planning that wants to produce the desired reality by constructing it and aestheticizing it through its contents. And so, for instance, those 800 cultural relics, which will be on display, they couldn't travel without a special house in which to exhibit them. The idea of sending 800 cultural relics to Hong Kong within this logic, to put them in a different museum, once we start to think about the significance of the cultural facility for housing the significant representations of culture, and especially to protect that high security material culture, must have a building, a designated purpose-built site. So, and I think this is confirmed when you actually see in the 2010 brief for the revised concept plan for West Kowloon. It requires Rogoyim, Foster's, and OMA to compare their design briefs to the cities of the Pearl River Delta, not to international model, global cities, world cities, but to Foshan and Dongguan and Huizhou. And this is rather, uncanny, but the rationale was clear that the express rail would deliver regional tourists, and the reference points should be reasonably similar yet differ. But it's also a way to compel the Hong Kong perspective to reflect back into the region, not to look abroad for its models, but to look carefully at China and its region. And so I think maybe the mayor's statecraft vision comes back in here, the historical statecraft that he's proposing, whereas Hong Kong had proposed a set of museums for a cultural district. They're very much in keeping with ideas about both international contemporary art and actually a lot of Hong Kong specialization in visual culture, Hong Kong film, Hong Kong cinema, and a number of interrelated histories of local cultural production in Hong Kong, including cartoon art and more. Does this statecraft vision kind of want to recast Hong Kong from the global city to the global pivot, in which Hong Kong must learn its place in the nation to and now it will become a good global pivot for intersecting with international connections rather than a global city that defines them? So the revised plan puts the Hong Kong Palace Museum over here. Certainly it's been under construction. And so I think there's a larger dialogue here about culture in the city that has been put forward, articulated by scores of groups, civil society, government, professional groups, arts and professional groups, the curators, the heads of art schools, which increased in number in the first, especially the first decade of the handover. So the Asia Art Archive, the extraordinary Asia Art Archive, that's the repository of this history. So, right, while government sought to produce, to construct culture in the city, like paradoxically, while the project itself languished, in the city known for constructing more quickly and then, sort of within budget than maybe any other city up to that time in Asia, up to its time, Hong Kong became a new international scene of art and culture. There are a number of ways we could see this. I've only included a sampling here across the talk and here wrapping up. One that explicitly references West Kowloon. And using the common materials of the red, white, blue plasticated material that's typically used on those bags, often called, well, yes, migrant bags, but not formally, but informally, migrant bags. But putting the material on aluminum frames, and these are sleeping cots. And it's the critique about the increasing inequality, people living in tenement housing in the absence of even formal bedroom space. And the West Kowloon behind the great cultural district, behind the great new high-rise Hong Kong Kowloon station. And so all the while, this focus on kind of the state, the role of the state in producing space, producing the cultural district, the tensions over it, the undisclosed, the unsayable. Meanwhile, extraordinary numbers of far less celebrated projects are taking place that are incredibly interesting. And so the critique of government by the arts community came early and fast. But the reality is that notion of Hong Kong as a so-called cultural desert, the dialogue across the city that took place in these couple of decades is like really from absence to subject. Culture became extraordinarily public. Well, the reality is, looking at the political side of Hong Kong, the Unsayable is highly managed. It's highly governed by the liaison office of the Hong Kong SAR in Hong Kong. And the ways in which its multiple committees carry out United Front activity. And that committee work is not to be disclosed, narrowing, this range of the sayable. And certainly there's a concern about the potential for drawing a determinist conclusion Nevertheless, both in kind of historic and contemporary Chinese cultural aesthetics, material culture, there's an extraordinary amount of symbolic cultural production. And it has proliferated in the context of political debate being carried out through symbolic materializations, as well as textual, but very much through a variety of contending projects. So most recently, the People's Daily, which of course is the main organ of state dissemination for the party, for the Chinese language sphere, political sphere, has come around to answer the question of why the project was not made public. And there's an extraordinary response. The reasons are hard to say, but everyone understands. It's about a very high level project. It projects back now onto the political undercurrents and the social turmoil, the unstated yet apparent need that a social stability is the hallmark of governing well, and that this project will now contribute to it. And so back around to historical statecraft, the Hong Kong Palace Museum director. And I think this does suggest the way in which, in that historical statecraft, Hong Kong will now need to be that, in this discourse, in this state-defined discourse, asking Hong Kong not to be the global city, to articulate in conversation, in cosmopolitan conversation with the world at large, but to be that pivot for international conversations in behalf of the nation. Collaborations with the Louvre. I found this one very interesting, and will be paying attention to what turns up. That apparently an incorporation of elite support, Hong Kong elite support for the project, because it will apparently allow Hong Kong private collectors to display their collected works. So that's interesting. And then it will apparently draw in local artists, but this is the most recent suggestion of programming. I've tried to think about here, this is in final conclusion, it's very open-ended. I tried to think about, ways of kind of conceptualizing the aesthetic in relation to the nation, in relation to material culture. And certainly there's a sense of combination at stake here. The way the nation comes in to seek to negotiate some questions about identity and comparison. But I do think after having studied the documents from Guangzhou, from the central government policymaking on cultural infrastructure, that the Palace Museum does represent the latest step in the construction of cultural infrastructure in the region, now for Hong Kong, in the extraordinary, unprecedented quasi-branch of the Beijing Palace Museum. Okay, thank you.